Okay. Now I got a question for you. African Americans and Latino Americans, they share a similar history, colonization, slavery. Moving forward, how can we work together, or like you say, make legal changes, or what advice would you give to somebody that may live in a community where there is some sort of separation or division between, the groups?
Well, I mean, I think one of the first things that we really have to get concrete about is a greater racial literacy. And what I mean by that is this: oftentimes, Latinos themselves, right, don't know about our history of slavery. Right? They don't know about the way in which statistically how predominant it was. We've got all kinds of mythologies about like how to explain, the variation in skin tone. Right? Once upon a time, there was a Native American. I mean, it's all kinds of stories that we tell ourselves to explain away the blackness. And so people are literally ignorant. Right? Similarly, within African American communities and others, we are ignorant, right, about the ways in which anti-blackness is a global phenomenon. Right? So rather than sort of treating it as just about a U.S. dynamic, I think we'd all be better able to engage in true solidarity and projects of coalition if we sort of learn a little bit more about just how entrenched anti-blackness is, and then thus be better able to recognize it, and similarly get better understanding about the existence of Afro Latinos. Sometimes I've seen this in the newspapers and what have you. Some celebrity or other, will say, that they're Afro Latino, and that gets perceived as, why this person now trying to say that they're black, right? They've always been black, right? But they were Latino yesterday. Well, they were always black and Latino. Like the two things can coexist, right? But blackness speaks many languages, not just English, because the slave ships went to many places, unfortunately, right? And so not only English-speaking locations. I think that would be a foundational piece, right? Before we could really see, collaborative and sort of community-based organizing that could sort of hold for longer than a protest or two.
Okay, wow, yeah, definitely. Let me see. Oh, I could recall an experience when I was studying abroad in DR. I met Ozzie Virgil. For the viewers who may not know him, he was the first Dominican to play in Major League Baseball. Dominicans love baseball. They probably the best baseball players in the world. But we had a conversation with him, and he was saying that he really, growing up in the DR, he didn't look at himself as a black person. But when he got to America, and I think he played for Detroit, and then when they would go down south and stuff, the whites would say, well, you got to get dressed with the black people, or you got to sit at the back of the bus with the black people. And then he say, he learned about his blackness and stuff like that. And even on the flip side with African Americans, like, for example, one time we was watching a boxing match, and it was like basically like a black guy and a white guy was fighting, but the people watching the fight, they was carrying on. And then when the fight was over, the announcer went up to him and he started speaking Spanish. And then the guy next to me, he like, I thought he was black. And I'm like, he is black. He just speaks Spanish. But to a lot of African Americans, they look at you as something else because they are ignorant as well to that history and that culture. And there's so many similarities. We got so much in common musically and food and the way we dance and everything else.
One bone of contention I would just put out there. There's this idea of, I didn't learn about blackness or discrimination until I came to the United States, and what that sort of like hides are the ways in which there's some serious discrimination that happens within Latin America. That was like my first book, right? But it gets recast as something else, right? Meaning the racial oppression within Latin America, right, and Spanish-speaking Caribbean nations has been so intense that Black people themselves have not always had the space within which to sort of articulate and understand their experiences as race-based experiences. but it doesn't mean that it's not happening, right? And instead, if you live in a place where, like in Latin America, for the longest time, if you brought up issues of racism, people would turn around and say, "You're the racist." Right? If you live in that kind of environment, right, then you have to, in some respects, reinterpret what's happening to you in order to survive it. Right? So a survival skill has long been, well, they didn't want to let me in the door, but maybe that's because I wasn't, addressed properly. They didn't want to sell me that house, but maybe it's because they thought I didn't have enough money for it. Right? We always are like having these built-in excuses, because when we try to articulate the issue as a race issue, they beat us down. Right? And so it's not so much always that it's about a discovery of the discrimination or discovery of oneself as Black. It's about now. I know some people may think this is ironic, but in the United States, there's sometimes more of a space to breathe and actually allow yourself to talk the language of Blackness and racism. Whereas you are silenced and it's taboo within so much of Latin America and the Caribbean. I mean, that's starting to change. There are many Afro-Latin groups on the ground who are doing very important social justice movement activism. But I'm trying to give you sort of like a historical, short snippet of a picture of what have the challenges been.
Oh yeah, definitely. I truly appreciate you. But I could relate because like you say, like when I was in Latin America studying, it wasn't commonly talked about. Because when I kept talking about it, people were like, I don't know. And then I'm like, okay, maybe I'm tripping. I'm gonna be quiet. And I waited like maybe a couple days, and then they wanted to talk about it more. The students was looking at me like, "What do you think?" And I'm like, "Nah, I don't want to say nothing." But you could tell that they, for a long time, some things that had been on their mind and they wanted to address them. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, Taye, he thinks it's a race problem in the DR." I'm like, "It's a race problem everywhere that's been colonized. And you got Black people that's been enslaved for hundreds of years, and then when slavery ended, they don't have no clothes, no shelter, no food, no education, no tools, no equipment." So a lot of Black Americans think that only happened in America, when the reality is in Latin America, it happened 90% of the slave trade is where it happened at. So that's very important. Let's see.